Yo, what's going on, Dragon Ballers? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going over the top sideboard cards for November 2022, and this is basically your side deck primer video for Nationals, since US Nationals is coming up this weekend. So we'll get into all this in today's video. If you're new here though, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell so you never miss a video. And if you guys want to support the channel, there are tons of ways to do so down in the description. But if you guys want to buy or pre-order any cards we talk about in today's video, or any trading cards for that matter, it does greatly help me out if you were to use my link to TCG Play down in the description. I really do appreciate it. Let's jump right on into the first card. We are starting with Black Smoke Dragon Accumulated Negativity. This is the new it card when it comes to side decks. We talked about Black Mass Sand in the past. We've talked about Machika Bora in the past. Those have been the two like generic, any deck can play them, answers to popular stuff in the meta. One of those is like completely phased out. One of those is still playable. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But Black Smoke Dragon is the new it card. This card gives you the ability to draw two if you have nothing better to do with it. But you also get the ability to remove a battle card ignoring barrier that costs 7 or less, or remove a 2 cost or less unison that has 7 or less markers straight up from the game. I mean, we're kind of, moving out of the Unison Warrior block and moving into the new Zenkai block. So it kind of makes sense that we would get better and easier answers to unisons. This card, though, implements some really interesting stuff into the format, because there are many good decks that rely on 2-cost unisons. Two big ones, I would say, are Gamma and SS4 Gogeta. And while this card, I wouldn't say like auto wins the matchup, it is really, really good against those decks. Any deck that your opponent slams a 2-cost unison, you're going to want to bring this card in. And the nice thing is, you're not just siding this card for the 2-cost base unison decks, because this card has other applications, like I mentioned before. This card is insane. Now, here's one thing though. I don't think that many red decks will want to side this card. Now, that's not to say that I don't think many red decks will side it. I'm sure that plenty of Gogeta and Sin players are going to roll up to Nationals siding Black Smoke Dragon. But I don't think it's a great card in those decks for this particular reason. I don't think it's great in those decks because it's not an aggressive tool. You cannot attack with this card. That is really important. Think about in the Sin and Gogeta deck, if you're paying 2 energy to not put pressure on your opponent, that's a real rough time that I think you're putting yourself in as a red player. Now, I will say there's, of course, exceptions to this rule. Like, let's just say your opponent has some sort of unison, maybe like Unison of Fury Vegeta, where it's just completely stifling your strategy. You cannot get around it for whatever reason. This could be a card to bring in those red decks, but let's be honest, Sin and Gogeta typically don't have that hard of a time dealing with unisons, especially when they don't actually gain markers per turn. This could possibly be good though against like certain barrier blockers or like really big things like Goku and Otherworld Blitz. Maybe you do want this for that card in particular against blue decks. But yeah, I think every other color except for the super aggressive decks will probably want to side this card. So still going to be a huge sideboard card for every other deck besides maybe red going into Nationals. But I'm sure red players will still show up with it even when maybe they shouldn't, but it's still really good. All right, then we have different hand control answers, because Magenta has been on a roller coaster throughout this entire season leading up to Nationals. That deck has been errated into some pretty heavy playability. I talked about it a bit more in the tier list video where I ranked all the archetypes in Fighter's Ambition, so go check that out if you want to see more so what I'm talking about with Magenta getting big buffs in the form of erratas and in the form of potentially miswritten cards. There's a card in Magenta that might be ruled a specific way at Nationals that makes it even stronger. But anyways, you may want to have your specific answers to hand control ready. If you are in the color yellow, and I think it's green that also has a card like this. Basically, Son Gohan, Trusted Ally, they're cards that are able to be played for free when they're discarded out of your hand, and they draw a card. So it takes any, simple pitch 1 effect your opponent uses on you and turns it into a net even, where you get even extra 5k combo power out of it, which is quite strong. And then, of course, for any deck or color that doesn't have access to a card like Gohan, Trusted Ally, you've got Bora Ritual at hand, which does cost 1. That's tough for some decks to use defensively, but it does draw 2 cards as a trade-off and produce a 15k body. So, of course, you want to have your answers for hand control. As far as other stuff besides Magenta to be afraid of going into Nationals, I don't think there's really much in the way of hand control prospects. Maybe Extra Broly will show up and do some hand control things, but that deck is not like huge on hand control like I would say Magenta is. So these might not even be like completely great sideboards for that matchup. But still, I mean, if you're siding 2 copies of Bora, you'd probably bring it in against most green decks, because most green decks have at least one way to make you pitch a card, right? So yeah, definitely want these for Magenta, maybe any other rogue green stuff you do come across. Then we have your slew of answers to the massive boss monsters in mostly the color red, but there are some applications for these cards in other matchups. So of course we have the Dirty Burst, which most blue decks are probably main decking at this point. We've got Unison of Fury. Now yellow was not much of a contender last format because last format was pretty much all red and a little bit of blue, so we don't really know what the main yellow contenders are going to look like going into national season, but they may want to sideboard Vegeta Unison of Fury, especially if they can protect it with a card like Robotic Riposte, which got stronger as a result of the set 19 ban list, so that might be an even better card to sideboard now. And then we have Shin Noble Supremacy for any deck in the game that doesn't really have a dedicated answer to really big boss monsters. You have the color green, for example, which does have a card like Big Amor, but that card feels really bad to play because you're basically discarding one card, paying 2 energy, and not doing anything proactive with your turn just so your opponent can't beat your face in with Gogeta or Sin Shenron, right? That doesn't feel really good. So even in a green deck, I'd probably consider Shin Noble Supremacy over Big Amor. What's also really cool about Shin Noble Supremacy, if you didn't think about this before, you can thank me in the comments. If you are playing blue Gohan, you are constantly stuck at 3 energy. So Shin Noble Supremacy will be live every single turn. You might want to just go ahead and side 3 to 4 copies of this card just because of that reason if you are playing blue Gohan. That's a really cool tech that we thought about here over at Crossworld TCG. Big brain innovative, I know, right? But yeah, it's cool if it's ever been pointed out to you. You might not have realized it. This is a really cool synergy in blue Gohan. Shin is great there. Otherwise, Shin is really only usable going second, but I mean, if you're going first against Gogeta or Sin, you already have a slight advantage anyway. So yeah, side to 740 going second. Since Nationals will be best of 3 format and not the typical best of 1 pre-sided we've been playing, you'll know the games where you're going first or second, right? So Shin will be great in those scenarios. Then we have Machika Bora, the Broken Seal. So I mentioned I would talk about this when we got here. Black Smoke Dragon being the new It card. Dark Power Black Mass Sand is kind of unplayable at this point. There's just not many decks that are actually playing 15Ks by skills that are super highly prevalent in the meta. Like Gogeta, mostly playing 20Ks. Sin is playing a few 15Ks, but those are not the cards you're super afraid of, so it's not even worth siding in that matchup. And then otherwise, like, maybe it'll be good against some rogue decks, but I think there are better cards you can dedicate your sideboard to. Machika Bora is solid, though. It's kind of another answer to big boss monsters like Gogeta GT8 or Omega Shenron Unfeeling Retribution. If you want to use this card to call those boss monsters, you can certainly do that. You can also use Machika Bora, the Broken Seal, to call out your opponent's SCR. Like, if you just know your opponent's coming up on turn 5 or whatever turn it is, and the last thing they can use to kill you is their SCR, but you're not really afraid of much else going on in their deck, Machika Bora can be a great answer to that. The cool thing about Machika Bora is that he is just super flexible if you know what your opponent's strategy entails. This is going to reward player knowledge pretty heavily. Good card overall, still very, very feasible to sideboard. All right, then we have different answers to Floodgates. Many decks are maining these types of cards, but if your deck isn't maining it or maybe lost it in the form of like Vegeta Resolve Renewed on the ban list, you might want to consider a card like Begrudging Allies, which is a 1-cost counter to any card 3 or less, which this will mainly be used against your opponent's Floodgates, as long as you're at 4 or less life. Of course, every color has different answers that do different things. This is just more of like the baseline generic one, but if you're looking for a counterplay in your color, like yellow for Tyrannical Blow or red for Beerus Ball, let's just say, you're going to want to look in your card pool's specific color wheel. But yeah, this is still a good generic option in general. And then of course there's Koitsukai. There's a lot of cool things about Koitsukai. It can fix your hand, it can punish your opponent for playing Floodgates. It doesn't outright stop those Floodgates, but it can punish them very heavily to where they may not want to commit the Floodgate, or you might turn the tide of the game inherently just by your opponent warping 2 cards to use their Ready to Rumble or Topo or whatever it is. So Koitsukai, very solid option, much more budget friendly now that it's been reprinted a few times. Begrudging Ally, also very budget friendly because it's a common from last set, but also just a good generic option to consider. Then we have your deck's respective Gohan rares. I've mentioned these cards in a few videos. I think that the different Gohan rares kind of, vary in power a little bit. Like I think the blue one, the green one, the black one are very, very good. The red and the yellow ones are a little less good, but they can still come up in certain situations for your respective decks. So these are cards that if you're not main boarding, you're heavily going to want to consider sideboarding. The green one might just be a main deck 3 of because of how good it is at killing Boo Unison alone. But yeah, cards like Gohan Power Reclaim you might want against like SS4 Gogeta, but you might not want it against like blue mirror matches, so maybe you'll sideboard it, right? There's things like that you want to consider with your main deck and side deck. But yeah, the Gohan rares are really nice additions to most players' side decks. Definitely worth considering and picking up. Then we have various Senzu Bean types of effects. So of course Senzu Bean was errated going into set 19 to where you can only use it defensively, but this is kind of on theme with a lot of other, you know, bean type effects, quote unquote, in the game. The reason is having the ability to permanently gain 5k during your opponent's turn is going to be very, very good for dealing with their onslaught or their go in turn. So of course any blue deck could just play Senzu Bean, just now it's only defensive. The two premier red decks have their own form of Senzu Bean. You know, Red Sin has Dragon Thunder, SS4 Gogeta has SS4 Goku Digging Deep. But if your deck doesn't have its own type of Senzu Bean effect, you can of course play Protector of the People, negate an attack, and then every time your opponent attacks with a battle card, you gain a stacking 5k. So eventually your leader is going to be too big for your opponent to even attack your leader, which is kind of a good effect to have in this format. And then wrapping up this video, we're talking about the Silver Bullets 2 Dimension Magic. Blue was pretty good last format. I mean, we had SS3 Reboot winning 2 American regionals, but most of the other regions that we covered here on the channel were just overly dominated by red. I do believe blue is going to make a comeback going into nationals format here. Maybe we'll see that in some other regions, but the European regions don't have set 19 legal yet, so we haven't really been able to see that in their national tournaments. But ignoring that, again, I think blue is going to do pretty well going into nationals, so you may want to have your respective answers to Dimension Magic. For green, it's Vegeta protecting his loved ones. For yellow, it's a Chi-Chi. For red, it's a Mai. Whatever that card is, you probably want to have it. But anyways, guys, that's what we got in today's video. If there are other cards you're considering side decking, drop them down in the comments for everyone to see. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.